right, everybody, Dr. Andy Woods here, and I want to welcome you to Pastor's Point of View number 200, believe it or not. Today is March the 4th, 2022. I just want to give a quick shout out to our good friend Dick Lane, who had his birthday yesterday, March the 3rd, 2022. So thank you, Dick, and happy birthday to you. What we have for you today is a prophecy update. Here's the four-part outline that we're going to follow. And let's just jump right in and start off with the subject that's on everybody's mind right now, Russia. Because of the Russian invasion of the Ukraine and the Ukrainians fighting back, it's been all over the news, etc., etc. There are many people, not just within evangelical Christianity, but prophecy ministries that have come out now and said Russia has absolutely nothing to do with Bible prophecy. You'll note this tweet here from Derek Gilbert of Skywatch News, and you'll notice on his Gog-Magog map. And of course, all of this deals with Ezekiel 38 and 39, which are those seminal and pivotal passages which are where Ezekiel depicted and predicted a northern invasion spearheaded by Russia into the land of Israel in the last days. You notice on his map here, he doesn't have Russia as part of this invasion. He's got other countries in the Middle East, but not Russia. And you'll notice what he says here. He says, no, Russia is not Magog. In Hebrew, Rosh means head. So this actually takes us into one of the greatest debates in prophecy, and it concerns one of the major players in the Gog-Magog invasion, Rosh. And there are two schools of thought on this. One school of thought is that Rosh simply is a common noun, and it just means chief, head, top, summit. Another school of thought, as I'll show you in a minute, is the fact that Rosh is actually not a common noun, but a proper noun describing a particular group and a particular geographical area. And the reason there's a dispute on this is because our Bible translations, our English Bible translations, go two different directions. Notice what the KJV says. Generally a good translation, but I think they've mishandled this particular verse. It says, Son of man, set thy face against Gog, the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshach, Tubal, and prophesy against him. So you'll notice there that the word Rosh is not even found in this translation. They just translate it through the English word chief. But you'll notice that the New American Standard Bible deals with this verse or translates it differently. It says, Son of man, set your face towards Gog of the land of Magog, the prince of Rosh. Now the KJV said chief, and the NASB says Rosh. And then it goes on, Meshach, Tubal, and prophesy against him. Why the dispute? Well, the KJV is treating Rosh as a common noun. The NASB is treating Rosh as a proper noun, meaning it's a particular group and a particular place on planet Earth, as real as is Meshach and Tubal and all the other players mentioned in this invasion. So you'll notice that Derek Gilbert is going with the KJV, common noun, but we don't think that's true. We think in this particular instance, the NASB has it right, and Rosh is actually a proper noun, not a common noun, meaning a specific people group and a specific place that's actually spearheading this invasion. So why do we think that the NASB has it right here? Well, I had a chance to go into this in my most recent Sunday school class. We're doing a series entitled The Middle East Meltdown. And if you go back to last Sunday's message, I think it's lesson number 8. You can find it on the Sugarland Bible Church website. It was given February 27th, 2022, and we explained in detail why we think Rosh is a proper noun. Let me just give you some of the highlights from that lecture. Here we're quoting from Mark Hitchcock's book entitled The End, and he has a wonderful explanation of this. He says, quote, "The weight of the evidence favors translating Rosh in Ezekiel 38 and 39 as a proper name. A proper noun or a proper name. 5 arguments support this view. First, the eminent Hebrew scholars C.F. Kyle, and let me just pause for a minute. Kyle is one of the co-authors of the famous Kyle and Delitzsch set, and it's considered to be, a standard academic work. So he says 5 arguments support this view. First, eminent scholars C.F. Kyle and Wilhelm Gesenius both hold that a proper noun is the better translation of Rosh in Ezekiel 38 verses 2 and 3, and in chapter 39 verse 1, referring to a specific geographical location. Now I'll say something more on Gesenius in just a moment. Second, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint. Now that's a Greek translation of the Old Testament given a couple of hundred years before the time of Christ, translates Rosh as the proper name Ross. This translation is especially significant since the Septuagint was translated only 3 centuries after Ezekiel was written. Remember, Ezekiel was written in the 6th century. Hitchcock goes on and says concerning the Septuagint translation, that's obviously much closer in time to the original than any modern translation. He says the modern translations of Rosh as an alternative adjective can be traced to the Latin Vulgate of Jerome. Now that was a translation basically from Hebrew into Latin, and that was a translation that the 16th century church reformer Martin Luther in the Protestant Reformation did not trust because he felt that it was interlaced with Roman Catholic ideas. So it's interesting that those translations that want to treat this as an adjective don't go back to the LXX, the Septuagint. Rather, they go back to Jerome's Latin Vulgate, which was mistrusted or not trusted by the Protestant reformers. Hitchcock goes on and he says, third, on their articles on Rosh, many Bible dictionaries and encyclopedias, like the New Bible Dictionary, the Wycliffe Bible Dictionary, the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia, support taking it as a proper name in Ezekiel 38. Fourth, and this point I find very interesting, Rosh is mentioned for the first time in chapter 38 and verse 2. We read a couple of translations of verse 2 earlier, but Hitchcock goes on and says, and then it's repeated in chapter 38 verse 3. And in chapter 39 verse 1, and he says if Rosh were simply a title, it would be dropped in these latter 2 places, because when titles are repeated in Hebrew, they are generally abbreviated. So if this is just a common noun or a title meaning chief or something like that, why would that title be repeated in the subsequent references to Rosh? And then he goes on and he says, fifth, the most important evidence in favor of taking Rosh as a proper name is simply that the translation in this context is the most natural. J.A. Cook translates chapter 38 verse 2 as, quote, the chief of Rosh, Meshach, and Tubal. He calls this, quote, the most natural way of rendering the Hebrew. Hitchcock concludes and he says the compelling evidence of biblical scholarship indicates that Rosh be understood as a proper name, the specific geographical area, close quote. Now, it's interesting that he not only quotes Kyle, an eminent scholar, but he also, Mark Hitchcock, quotes Wilhelm Gesenius. And you'll notice what Gesenius says, and you have to keep in mind who Gesenius was before you figure out what he said. He is the father of lexicography, which is the science and art of compiling dictionaries, in this case, Hebrew dictionaries. And here's a quote from Gesenius's Hebrew and Chaldee lexicon, which, like the Keil and Delitzsch set, is a standard. And this was written and created all the way back in 1847. That's when it was ultimately printed. And you'll notice that Gesenius says of Rosh, I've got it underlined there, he says a proper noun. Better said, a proper name. Of who? Of a northern nation mentioned with Tubal and Meshach. So Gesenius, just like Kyle, felt that Rosh was not a common noun, but in fact it was a proper noun and a proper name. So half of this battle is trying to come down on, is this a common noun or a proper noun or a proper name? For the reasons stated, we're of the persuasion that it is actually a proper noun and a proper name, indicating not just a title of somebody, but a specific group of people on planet Earth. The second part of the battle then is figuring out, okay, if Rosh is indeed a proper name, how do we know that Rosh refers to the Russians? Because there's an awful lot of people that will malign our position that Rosh is Russia because we think we cling to this view because Rosh just sounds like Russia, and so they kind of make fun of us. Oh, Rosh sounds like Russia. That's your only basis for believing Rosh is Russia. So let's move now to a lexical argument. Mark Hitchcock, in his book The End, says first, and he's giving some reasons why Rosh really means Russia. He says first, linguistically and historically, there is substantial evidence that in Ezekiel's day there was a group of people known variously as Rosh, Rishu, or Ross, who lived in what today is southern Russia. Egyptian inscriptions as early as 2600 BC, which, as far as I can tell, that's a lot nearer in time to the time of Ezekiel's prophesying than many modern day English translations. He says Egyptian inscriptions as early as 2600 BC identify a place called Rosh. A later Egyptian inscription from 1500 BC refers to a land called Rishu that was located to the north of Egypt. Other ancient documents include a place named Rosh or its equivalent in various languages. Hitchcock goes on and he says the word appears 3 times in the Septuagint, 10 times in Sargon's inscriptions, once in Ashurbanipal's cylinder, once in Sennacherib's annals, and 5 times in Ugaritic tablets. And here's the conclusion. While the word has a variety of forms and spellings, it is clear that the same people are in view. Rosh was apparently a well-known place in Ezekiel's day. Now, Mark Hitchcock at Dallas Seminary did his master's thesis on this subject, and this is largely what he's rehashing in his book called The End. So Rosh, you can actually identify the specific people group and geographical area that Ezekiel was speaking of. You'll notice this scholar here named Clyde Billington. You'll notice what he says in the Michigan Theological Journal. You'll notice the academic sources that I'm quoting from, and he does the same analysis. He says Rosh is a proper name, and he traces the meaning of Rosh in various ancient Near Eastern sources, wrote several academic articles on this subject, and here's his conclusion. Billington says, quote, historical, ethnological, and archaeological evidence all favor the conclusion that the Rosh people of Ezekiel 38 and 39 were the ancestors of Rus, or the Ross people of Europe and Asia. Those Rosh people who lived to the north of the Black Sea in ancient and medieval times were called Rus, Ross, Rox, Arasi from very early times. Here's the conclusion. Billington says, quote, the Rosh people of the area north of the Black Sea formed the people known today as the Russians. So you'll notice that the translation or interpretation that we're giving, where Rosh is a proper name and Rosh refers to Russia, is not just trying to rhyme Rosh with Russia to hype things up to sell some books. There's actually academic reasons for taking Rosh as Russia. Let's go back and let's remember again this quote from Wilhelm Gesenius. We had the quote up earlier. He says of the word Rosh in his standard Gesenius's Hebrew and Chaldee lexicon, quote, a proper name of a northern nation mentioned with Tubal and Meshach. In other words, you take Rosh as a specific place on planet Earth emanating from a specific people group, the same way you would take Tubal and Meshach. And he says, undoubtedly the Russians. Now, that's not some popular sensationalist in Bible prophecy circles saying that. That's Gesenius. He goes on and he says, who are mentioned by the Byzantine writers of the 10th century under the name Ross, dwelling to the north of Taurus, as dwelling on the river, the Volga, I think is how you pronounce that, the Volga River. So I guess what I'm trying to say is this idea that Rosh has absolutely nothing to do with Russia. And if you think Rosh has anything to do with Russia, then you're obviously doing newspaper exegesis, reading the newspaper back into the Bible. You can see how silly their perspective is. Rosh is a proper noun. Rosh, by tracing the name through various ancient Near Eastern sources, can be identified, as scholars have done, like Clyde Billington, like Wilhelm Gesenius, as Russia. Look at the date of Gesenius's work, 1847. Now that's long before the Bolshevik communist revolution in Russia, where Russia, because of that hateful ideology, would become anti-Western and ultimately anti-Israel. So it's long before that happened. It's when Russia was a fairly weak, unknown Christian Orthodox country. This was long before the rise of Russia as a modern-day nuclear superpower. So obviously Gesenius in 1847, when this was published, is not doing newspaper exegesis. He's following standard scholarship. So number one, Rosh is a proper noun, a proper name. Number two, you can pinpoint Rosh as the Russians through academic sources. And let me throw a few clues at you, just reading straight out of my Bible here. We've given you a lexical, exegetical argument. Let me give you a geographical argument. I don't think I have these particular verses in any of my slides, but you can follow along in your your own translation of the Bible. It says in chapter 38, verse 6, Gomer with all its troops, Beth Togarmah, watch this now, from the remote parts of the north. It's very clear that this invasion is coming from the remote parts of the north. Now, I'm a patterns person. When I see a pattern, it sort of jumps out to me. You start to see a pattern in the Bible when the Holy Spirit repeats something several times. The expression from the remote parts of the north is repeated in verse 15. Chapter 38, verse 15 says, You will come from your place out of the remote parts of the north. And then notice chapter 39 and verse 2. I will turn you around, drive you on, take you up from the remote parts of the north, and bring you against the mountains of Israel. So you'll notice that this invasion coming against Israel comes from the remote parts of the north. And you say, well, north from what? Well, in Bible prophecy, it's the center of everything is Israel. And so when it says from the remote parts of the north, it's talking about due north, far north from Israel. I do have a slide on this. If you look at chapter 38 and verse 12, the same chapter describes as Israel living at the center of the world. And over in Ezekiel chapter 5 and verse 5, it describes Jerusalem as the center of the nations. So you have to start thinking the way God thinks. To most of the world community, Israel is a tiny nation in the way of global progress. But as far as God thinks, Israel is at the center of divine activity. In fact, it's interesting, this word translated center in these passages, chapter 38 and verse 12, and chapter 5 and verse 5 is the Hebrew word for navel or belly button, which is the center of the body. Just as the belly button is the center of the body, Israel is the centerpiece of divine activity in the last days. And so when it says due north 3 times, remote north of Israel, it's talking about due north from Israel, more specifically the city of Jerusalem. And when you look at our map here, what you see is Rosh, or Russia, I've got it circled, is that political power from the remote part of the land of Israel. And so whether you're going to use a geographical argument or a lexical and exegetical argument, as did Gesenius, Billington, and others, you see very clearly that Rosh equals Russia. Step 1, as we've tried to explain, Rosh is a proper name, not a common noun. Step 2 is you can show that Rosh, based on ancient Near Eastern sources, can be identified with Russia or the Russians. And step 3 is the geographical argument, where we're just going due north. And we can see what nation is due north or to the uttermost north or to the remote north of where? Of Israel in general and Jerusalem in particular. And it's undoubtedly Russia is the one involved in this invasion. And so Ezekiel 38 and 39 predicts this northern invasion, and it predicts it being spearheaded by none other than Russia. Now, when Gesenius made this statement it was published in 1847, and he said Russia is going to invade Israel, there was no Israel to invade. Israel hadn't become a modern-day country yet. And so here's Gesenius simply taking God at his word, predicting a Russian-led invasion against Israel before the Communist Revolution in 1917, before Russia became a nuclear superpower, and before there was an Israel for Russia to invade. And here we are in our time period seeing largely the fulfillment of these prophecies that Ezekiel made all the way back in the 6th century BC. So that now catches us up with the Ukrainian invasion. Notice this map here. We've got Russia circled. We've got the Ukraine circled in red. And we've got this arrow going down to the land of Israel. And so you'll notice that as Russia invades the Ukraine, it's moving in the direction of Israel. I mean, that's what's clearly shown in this map. And so when Russia all of a sudden invades the Ukraine, and that's on a trajectory from north to south, ultimately into the land of Israel, we think that this is prophetically significant. Now, obviously, the Russian invasion of the Ukraine is not a fulfillment of Ezekiel's prophecies, but it certainly makes Ezekiel's prophecies very credible, does it not? I mean, Ukraine is not in the opposite direction. I mean, Ukraine is in that trajectory from north to south, ultimately into the land of Israel. And so we believe that eventually Putin, or perhaps one of his successors, will invade the land of Israel exactly like the Bible says, exactly as Ezekiel predicted 2,600 years ago, and exactly as recognized by great scholars like Wilhelm Gesenius, Clyde Billington, Mark Hitchcock, Kyle, etc., etc., etc. Does Russia have an ambition ultimately to invade the land of Israel? In other words, the Ukraine is just sort of step one. Will they ultimately end up in the land of Israel? I think the answer is yes. Now, notice this article that we have here from the Jerusalem Post by Tova Lazaroff, February the 24th, 2022, and it says Russia takes issue with Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights and Jerusalem. Russia doesn't recognize Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights that are part of Syria, Russian ambassador says. Notice this article. Moscow took issue with Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights and Jerusalem just prior to its attack on the Ukraine. Russia doesn't recognize Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights that are part of Syria. Its deputy, Dmitry Polansky, told the United Nations Security Council, which held a debate on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict on Wednesday. This monthly Security Council meeting took place as the General Assembly debated the Russian-Ukrainian crisis. Israel annexed Golan in 1981, but to date, the United States is the only country that recognizes that sovereignty. He, that's the Russian ambassador, also, watch this very carefully, indirectly took issue with his comments with the Israeli sovereignty over Jerusalem, including West Jerusalem. In 2017, Moscow said that it recognized West Jerusalem as Israel's capital, but Polansky appeared on Wednesday to ignore that recognition of Israel's government, using Tel Aviv as a synonym for Israel's government. It is a phrase used only by those countries who mean to convey that they do not recognize Israeli sovereignty over any part of the capital city. So, close quote. Here is the Russian ambassador at this recent, or before this recent gathering of the United Nations Security Council, saying we do not recognize that the Golan Heights belong to the nation of Israel. What are the Golan Heights? Here's a map here. It's that rocky buffer zone that separates Israel from Syria. It's a key strategic geographical area comprising a buffer zone between Israel and one of its enemies, Syria. And you might recall that it was Donald Trump that recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. And here's Russia saying, we don't recognize that. We don't recognize that the Golan Heights belongs to Israel. We think the Golan Heights still belongs to Syria. Now, why would you say something like that publicly unless your ambition is to invade that territory? In the article, if you listen carefully, they also don't recognize the fact. Well, before I get to that, you'll notice this tweet here from the Russian Mission UN, and they say, we're concerned over Tel Aviv's announced plans for expanding settlement activity in the occupied Golan Heights, which contradicts the provisions of the 1949 Geneva Convention. Russia doesn't recognize Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights that are part of Syria. And it's interesting, in the article that I read earlier, they also do not recognize the fact that the capital of Israel is Jerusalem. They still want to indicate that the capital of Israel is in Tel Aviv. Now, you remember that Donald Trump moved the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, thus recognizing that Jerusalem is the historic capital of undivided Israel, going back virtually 3,000 years to the time of David, where David declared the city of Jerusalem to be the capital of Israel, and you'll see that happening in the book of 2 Samuel chapter 5. When Donald Trump moved the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, he was recognizing that Jerusalem is the historic capital of undivided Israel. And now here comes this Russian ambassador recently before the United Nations Security Council saying, well, we think the capital and our embassy should still be in Tel Aviv. So Trump recognized the Golan Heights belonged to the nation of Israel and not Syria. Russia says we do not make that acknowledgement. We do not make a similar acknowledgement. They're saying this publicly. Donald Trump moves our embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. The ambassador of Russia before the United Nations Security Council says we don't make that recognition. Now, why would you be publicly saying things like this unless it's your ultimate attempt and intent, I should say, to invade the land of Israel, exactly like the Bible says? So what Russia has done recently with the Ukraine is really step one. Their ultimate trajectory is to go into the land of Israel, which we believe makes the Gog-Magog invasion that Ezekiel predicted 2,600 years ago extraordinarily credible. Let's go to our second category here, and it has to do with climate change. And despite what has just happened in the news, Russia invading a sovereign country, the Ukraine, very sadly, the biggest subject on John Kerry's mind is climate change. I mean, he's not worried about, these Ukrainians defending their own country. He's worrying about the impact that Russia's invasion of the Ukraine is going to have on climate change. Notice this article by Harris Alec, February the 24th, 2022. It says John Kerry urges Putin to not let the Ukraine invasion distract from combating climate change. This comes out of the Washington Times. The article says, quote, the White House's international climate envoy, John Kerry, warned Russia not to lose sight of the bigger need to combat climate change as it targets the Ukraine. Mr. Kerry, a former Secretary of State, told BBC News earlier this week that it was important for Russian President Vladimir Putin and other global leaders to remain committed to lowering greenhouse emissions. Kerry said, "I hope diplomacy will win. But equally importantly, you are going to lose people's focus. You're going to lose, certainly, big country attention." Mr. Kerry said. Kerry goes on and he says, "I think hopefully President Putin would realize that in the northern part of his country, they used to live on 66% of frozen land. Now it's thawing and his infrastructure is at risk and the people of Russia are at risk." Kerry added, "I hope President Putin will help us to stay on track with respect to what we need to do for the climate," close quote. Now this, to me, is absolutely astonishing. As one country invades another sovereign country, what is the number one issue on John Kerry's mind? Not Russian aggression. The number one issue on his mind is the impact this is going to have on climate change. Why would I include this in a prophecy update? Because I want us to see how entrenched this climate change mentality is. As we have explained on this show many, many times, climate change that's caused by man, anthropogenic climate change, is nothing more than a management by crisis strategy. It's convincing the world of a global crisis that supposedly man is causing. And if we believe this is true, then we have to accept global governance to solve this global crisis. Individual nations, we're told, can't solve this. We have to acquiesce to global governance. And so it is literally the pedal to the metal, to the very end, as far as the globalist agenda is concerned, to push this climate change agenda. They are not going to let off the gas pedal on this, even to the point where one country invades another and somehow that's related to the climate. And he's not concerned about a nation being sovereignly invaded. He's concerned about the potential impact on climate change. The globalists cannot and will not let go of this issue because it's their whole pretext and it's their whole narrative for global government, which very sadly will come into existence one day. Bible prophecy tells us that in many passages that we've already gone over on our show in prior shows, like Daniel chapter 7, verse 23, etc. In fact, in the globalist mindset, climate change is just as severe as terrorism, epidemics, poverty, and the proliferation of nuclear weapons. Look at what John Kerry said on his remarks concerning climate change when he was in the Obama administration. Now he's saying these things as the climate czar in the Biden administration. Well, this is nothing new for him. He was saying these same kinds of things in the Obama administration all the way back in 2014. This is from a government website, and this is related to a speech that he gave back then. He said, quote, "When I think about the array of global threats, terrorism, epidemics, poverty, the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, all challenges that know no borders." And let me stop right there. That language, no borders, is very, very significant, because if these challenges know no borders, they must be global in nature, and the only way to fix them is through global governance. Continuing with the quote, he says, all challenges that know no borders. The reality is that climate change ranks right up there with every single one of them. Or think about the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. It doesn't keep us safe if the United States secures its nuclear arsenal while other countries fail to prevent theirs from falling into the hands of terrorists, close quote. So in the mind of John Kerry, climate change is just as bad as terrorism, nuclear weapons, the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, poverty, global epidemics, etc. And that was in 2014, and here we are in 2022, and now he's saying the exact same thing, where his number one concern when Putin invades the Ukraine is, oh my goodness, what kind of effect is this going to have on climate change? So climate change, full speed ahead, keep the accelerator on, pedal to the metal, all the way into global governance, because this is the global crisis that the one-worlders desperately need as a narrative or as a pretext for global government. Let's go to our third category here in this prophecy update, and this has to do with the perpetual movement, I should say, into the mark of the beast technology. Remember what Bible prophecy indicates concerning the mark of the beast. Notice the book of Revelation, if you could, chapter 13, verses 16 through 18, a well-known prophecy. It says, he, that's the Antichrist, causes all, the small and the great, the rich and the poor, the free and the slaves, to be given a mark on their right hand or their forehead. And he provides that no one will be able to buy or sell except the one who has the mark, either the name of the beast or the number of his name. Here is wisdom. Let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for the number is that of a man, and his number is 666. So it envisions here a system where no one is permitted to buy or sell unless they receive some sort of mark on their right hand or their forehead. And let me be very clear that we do not believe that things that are happening in the world today are the actual mark of the beast, because we don't have the beast yet. You can't have the mark of the beast without the beast, and he won't be unveiled until the post-rapture, after the rapture, and the tribulation period begins. However, we believe very strongly in prophetic stage setting, and we believe that the world is being prepared in a technological way, in an economic way, and in a psychological way to receive this mark of the beast system once it shows up. And it is very interesting to me as you watch technology growing and evolving and developing, is technology never moves in the opposite direction of what the Bible predicts. It always seems to inch closer and closer to what the Bible indicates will encompass the entire world. It says here, small and great, rich and poor, free and slave. It encompasses all. What the Bible predicts will envelop the entire world at the end of the age. So we have a brief video clip to show you, if we could, and this has to do with the banking and financial system in Canada, and I want you to observe how eerily similar this sounds to Revelation 13, verses 16 through 18. It's just a 2-minute clip, so let's run that if we could.
Innovation. Canada is on the cusp of a revolutionary innovation that will transform the way Canadians authenticate themselves online and protect their identity. Digital ID. All of us are living in a digital world, but we're tethered to an analog model of how we identify ourselves, memorizing countless online passwords, carrying government-issued licenses, plastic cards, and more. Digital ID is a way for Canadians to identify themselves to government, businesses, and each other electronically, with ease and rock-solid security. without the need to present physical documents. One interconnected network. A federated digital ID ecosystem developed in collaboration with Canada's best and brightest talent from our banks, telecommunication companies, law enforcement, and government. It would have the power and security to store every Canadian's electronic identity and attributes. And it would unlock countless opportunities for Canadians to verify who they are safely, quickly, and securely, while only revealing the information necessary for each transaction. A fast, easy, and secure way to bank, sign up for government services, renew driver's licenses or health cards, shop, travel, and more. Canada's banks are perfectly situated to help lead the creation of a federated digital ID system between government and the private sector. The World Economic Forum agrees that banks and financial institutions should lead the path forward for digital ID. Banks are highly regulated and trusted. They have advanced cybersecurity and privacy technology, and they have the infrastructure to operate provincially and nationally. Banks are also at the forefront of working with fintech startups who are bringing revolutionary mobile and online products and services to Canadians. Digital ID can help consumers navigate between these apps and programs with trust and confidence, knowing their ID is protected at all times. A federated digital ID approach can also significantly reduce fraud, save taxpayer money, improve regulatory compliance, and make it easier to do business as an owner and as a consumer. In fact, the Canadian Bankers Association just launched a white paper with our recommendations on how to move forward with a federated digital ID framework. I encourage you to read it to learn more. Revolutionary Innovation.
Canada. All right. Well, I find that very interesting. This is put out apparently by the World Economic Forum, the group, as we have covered many times on this show, that's seeking to reset the planet subsequent to the pandemic. And they apparently have a lot of plans for the Canadian banking system. I think Canada is just a few steps ahead of the United States in this regard. And it's talking about, forget all these credit cards, forget all these, different forms of ID. Let's just give everybody one piece of ID, a digital ID. And how is it being sold? These things are always sold through the language of convenience. Think how convenient it will be for you. They never explain to you your loss of privacy and your loss of freedom once you're put into the system. And once you're put into the system and you discover your loss of freedom and your loss of privacy, it's too late, because the foot is already in the bear trap. You have been entrapped, you have been ensnared, and you can't get out. And so it's interesting to me that this is moving us very clearly in the direction of the mark of the beast system. It's not going the opposite way. All of these technological advancements and new thinking in the area of banking and economics seem to always inch us closer and closer to what the Bible predicts for the end of the age. One of the voices to be aware of in all of this is the voice of Naomi Wolf. I find her to be very interesting because she is no conservative. She has no conservative bias that I know of, because she was at one time worked for President Bill Clinton. She is a Democrat, but she also is the head of a tech firm, and so she has technological or tech understanding, and she is coming out and she is warning very aggressively against jab passports. She says jab passports are the end of human liberty. And notice this quote. She says of these jab passports, it's literally the end of human liberty in the West if this plan unfolds as planned. Once this rolls out, you don't have a choice about being part of the system. It has the power to turn off your life or turn on your life. It geolocates you everywhere you go. Your credit history can be included. All of your medical history can be included. It would be the end of civil society, close quote. And she's talking about this type of technology in banking. And we just saw the video clip about that earlier, put out by the World Economic Forum, and how this is being married to jab passports. And she's warning, be very careful about the loss of privacy and the loss of freedom that people will have once they're in this system. And by the time they get put into this system, they won't be able to get out because the trap will have already been sprung. And if you don't think this type of thing can come to the United States, think again. Notice this article from Forbes, a reputable source, obviously, by Suzanne Rowan Keller, February the 24th, 2022. The title of this article is "A National Jab Pass Has Quietly Rolled Out, and Red States Are Getting on Board." Here's a little excerpt from the article. Quote, "Even as the Omicron variant loosens its grip on the world, destinations continue to require travelers to show proof of being jabbed. And increasingly, a paper CDC jab card is not cutting it. While the United States government has not issued a federal digit pass in this regard, a national standard has nevertheless emerged. Forbes says, to date, 21 states, the District of Columbia, and Puerto Rico offer accessibility to the Smart Healthcare Card, a verifiable digital proof of being jabbed, developed through the VCI initiative, a global coalition of public and private stakeholders, including Microsoft, Salesforce, Oracle, the Mayo Clinic, and other health and tech heavyweights. And very soon, at least 4 more states will be rolling out access to smart health cards. We've seen a notable uptick in states that have officially launched public portals where individuals can get verifiable jab credentials in the form of smart health cards or with a QR code, says Dr. Brian Anderson, co-founder of the VCI and chief digital health physician at MITRE, close quote, end of article. And you put this data together, whether it's jab passports, whether it's digital ID in Canadian banks, and I think we would all agree that we are not moving further away from the mark of the beast technology. We're moving closer and closer to these things. And so we bring this to your attention in this prophecy update. And the very last, but certainly not least, the last category that we want to talk about very briefly here is our judiciary. And you have to keep an eye very carefully on what's happening with Supreme Court picks and Supreme Court vacancies. Why keep an eye on that? Because of something Thomas Jefferson said. I think Thomas Jefferson would know a little something about the founding of America, and he issued this warning in one of his private letters. He said, quote, "You seem to consider judges as the ultimate arbiters of all constitutional questions. A very dangerous doctrine indeed, and one which would place us under the despotism of an oligarchy." Stopping the quote just for a minute, an oligarchy comes from the Greek word oligos, meaning small or few. It's this idea where you're actually being governed by a very small group of people. Thomas Jefferson continues and he says, "Our judges are as honest as other men, and not more so, and their power more dangerous, as they are in office for life and not responsible as the other functionaries are to elective control. The Constitution has erected no such single tribunal. Question mark. Thomas Jefferson warned, he says, don't put too much power in the Supreme Court. Or don't make it seem as if the Supreme Court is the only one that can tell you what the Constitution means. Because once you do that, you're under an oligarchical system. Meaning you're governed. In our case, we now have 9 members on the Supreme Court. You just need 5 for a majority opinion. You're really being governed by just 5 people. And 5 people who are appointed for life, which is what happens at the federal level, and are not accountable, therefore, to the American people at the next election cycle, can make the Constitution sound any way they want. Thomas Jefferson elsewhere says they can twist it just like you would twist wax and make it any way you please it to be to pursue a personal, political, ideological agenda which was never voted on by the people. And so, since we now have a Supreme Court vacancy and now a Supreme Court nominee, we need to bring this issue to your attention. One of the greats in modern times warning of this was a man named Lino Graglia. I may have the pronunciation of that wrong, but he wrote an article as a law professor in the South Texas Law Journal back in 1985. The title of that article is Judicial Review on the Basis of Regime Principles, a Prescription for Government by Judges. And notice his warning. He warns, quote, judicial usurpation of legislative power has become so common and so complete that the Supreme Court has become our most powerful an important instrument of government in terms of determining the nature and power of American life. Questions literally of life and death, abortion and capital punishment, for example, of public morality, such as the control of pornography, prayer in the schools, and government aid to religious schools, and of public safety, such as things like criminal procedure and demonstrations, are now in the hands of judges under the guise of constitutional law. The fact that the Constitution says nothing of, say, abortion, and indeed explicitly and repeatedly recognizes the capital punishment that this court has come close to prohibiting, has made no difference. The result is that the central truth of constitutional law today is that it has nothing to do with the Constitution, except that the words due process or equal protection are almost always used by judges in stating their conclusions. Not to put too fine a point on it, but constitutional law has become a fraud, a cover for a system of government by the majority vote of a 9-person committee of lawyers, unelected and holding office for life, close quote. Now, this is exactly what Thomas Jefferson warned about. And if I could kind of disagree mildly with one of the things the professor here says, he warns about a 9-person committee. It's really not a 9-person committee. It's really a 5-person committee because you only need 5 for a majority opinion. And because our jurists largely believe that the Constitution is a living, evolving document, meaning they can make it sound any way they want, we are now in the form of an oligarchy. And what if we disagree with their rulings? Well, too bad, because they are appointed for life. And so that's why you always have to pay attention to what's going on at the federal judicial level, particularly at the level of the United States Supreme Court. And so now we have Justice Breyer retiring. Biden has picked a new, or nominated, I should say, a new person to be on the court. This person's last name is Brown Jackson. And you'll notice this article by Eric Thompson, February the 24th, 2022. You can find this on frankspeech.com. The article says Biden's choice is a radical judge named Ketanji, if I'm pronouncing that right, Brown Jackson, who was previously Biden's first confirmed appellate judge in 2021. Judge Jackson has an awful record with several of her major decisions getting overturned by appeals courts, I should say. Here are just a few. Interrupting the quote just for a minute. When a judge at the lower level keeps getting overturned by higher courts, that means the judge's rulings aren't based in the text of the Constitution. It's based on their own personal politics and their own policy understanding and their own predilections. But here are just a few examples of some of her radical rulings at the lower court level. Jackson ruled that Don McGahn must testify to Congress about his time as Trump's White House counsel. Another one of her rulings is last July, Judge Ketanji Jackson temporarily blocked the deportation of 2 immigrants who claimed that the Trump administration's new lesson plan for asylum officers makes it harder to prove fear of returning to their home country. Her ruling was so radical that acting U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Director Ken Cuccinelli slammed the activist judge. So we're dealing with someone who makes rulings that are very leftist, not in touch with the actual wording of the United States Constitution. Here is another article, February 28th, 2022. This one comes from the Post-Millennial, and it says Biden's SCOTUS, that would be Supreme Court of the United States nominee, once argued the judicial system is unfair to sexual predators. Notice the opening line here. President Joe Biden's Supreme Court nominee, Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson, once authored an unsigned note in the Harvard Law Review arguing that America's judicial system is unfair to sexual predators, according to findings discovered by the American Accountability Foundation investigation. Going to the very end of the article, it says AAF founder, again that stands for the American Accountability Foundation. AAF founder Tom Jones said, quote, Americans want our judicial system to protect children and citizens from sexual predators. Judge Brown Jackson's radical position raises questions on her suitability to serve on the court. Is she more interested in social justice engineering or administering justice? Close quote. And this is the whole problem that Lino Grigaglia warned against. It's the whole problem Thomas Jefferson warned against. Once judges see themselves as people there to promote a personal ideology, they would actually function as an oligarchy. Now, what does this have to do with the end times? Notice this slide here from Robert Bork. Do a little background study on Robert Bork if you don't know who he was. He was one of the heroes in this regard. His nomination by President Reagan to the United States Supreme Court was shot down back in the 1980s by the Senate Judiciary Committee, and Bork became a well-known voice for original intent. In other words, judges aren't there to promote their own ideology. They're there to figure out what the Founding Fathers intended on a particular issue and apply that original intent as they're adjudicating matters that come before them. It's the voice of originalism. And Robert Bork's final book that he wrote prior to his death was something called Coercing Virtue. The subtitle is The Worldwide Rule of Judges. And he was warning against judges taking their cues not from American law and the original intent of America's Constitution, but from international trends, and bringing those international trends into their decisions. That's how the Supreme Court, in a case called Lawrence versus Texas, ruled unconstitutional an anti-sodomy statute in the state of Texas, when in fact back in 1986, in a case called Bowers versus Hardwick in the state of Georgia, the Supreme Court had upheld such statutes. What's the difference? Well, in 2003, the Supreme Court's base of authority changed, and they were looking at international law rather than the United States Constitution. And I'm here to tell you, folks, that the unelected, unaccountable federal judiciary, more than any other thing I can think of, is dragging the United States kicking and screaming into the New World Order because of this trend that I'm describing here. And that's why paying attention to this Supreme Court vacancy and this new nomination is something that has to be mentioned in a prophecy update, because how is the United States going to get pulled into the New World Order? Through these oligarchical liberal judges that view their role as evolving the United States Constitution in any way they please. And very, very sadly, the only reason Biden is appointing this person is because he wanted to appoint the first black woman to the United States Supreme Court. Now, I'm here to tell you that I don't really care if the person is black or white, male or female. The issue is, are they an originalist after the pattern of Robert Bork, or are they not? Or are they there to pursue their own ideology? One of my favorite jurists and justices on the United States Supreme Court, a true originalist, as far as I can tell, is a man named Clarence Thomas. And I like him because of his rulings. His skin color, as you know, which happens to be black, is irrelevant. So what they're trying to do is trying to make it sound like if you're against this nominee, you're against women and you're against blacks. And that, of course, is a ridiculous sentiment, because conservatives and constitutionalists all love Clarence Thomas, and he happens to be black. So don't let the black, white, male, female issue divert you from what's really going on here. What's really going on here is a long-standing battle between oligarchy on the Supreme Court or originalists on the Supreme Court. If there's an oligarchy on the Supreme Court, the power rests with 5 people and not the branches of government, like the legislative branch, which is accountable to the people. If originalists are on the Supreme Court, then what rules the day is the Founding Fathers' ideas. Everything else that needs to be changed, supposedly, needs to be resolved by the legislature, which is the branch of government that's closest to the people. So this really is a power to the people moment concerning the current trajectory of our United States Supreme Court. And as best we can tell, this current appointee, this current nominee by President Biden, is taking the United States of America and pulling us exactly in the wrong direction. We do like to conclude with a note of hope. As we like to say, things are not falling apart, they're falling into place. Titus 2 verse 13 says, looking for the blessed hope and the appearing of the glory of our great God and Savior, Jesus Christ. Our ultimate hope as Christians is not on whether the United States of America turns back to its origins, but on the soon appearing of Jesus Christ to rescue us out of this world. Things, as we like to say, quoting the late Adrian Rogers, are growing gloriously dark. As the stage is being set for the New World Order and the tribulation period, that makes more vivid the promise of Jesus Christ to rescue us out of the world before the tribulation period begins. Also take note of our conference that we're going to be doing on Israel's birthday. It's a Saturday, Sunday conference featuring myself, Olivier Milnick, and Jeff Kinley. Special music with Corey and Lev Shalot, as we have a conference recognizing the importance of Israel in God's plan and program. Unfortunately, we are now at capacity, but if you want to get on the waiting list, call or email the church, Sugarland Bible Church, to get put on that waiting list, because we've had some cancellations, and so people on the waiting list, have a pretty good chance of moving up if they desire to do that. And if you can't make it into the building live, don't fret, because we plan on live streaming the whole thing through the Sugarland Bible Church website. My book on Babylon has been out for a while. You can access that if you're interested. Beyond that, encourage you to tune in to our Wednesday evening studies from 7 to 8 p.m. Central that we're doing through the book of Zechariah. Just last couple nights ago, we finished Zechariah chapter 9 and verse 10. And so we're in really now the heart of that prophetic section of the book. And so even if you haven't heard the former parts of the study, this is still a great place to jump in with us. You can find that live streamed on the Sugarland Bible Church Facebook page, the Sugarland Bible Church website, www.slbc.org, and of course on that website all of our material, including the study we just did this Wednesday prior, can be found there as well. We're also teaching Sunday school from 9:45 to 10:45 a.m. Central, verse by verse through Ezekiel chapters 38 and 39 in a study called The Middle East Meltdown. I can't believe how relevant this study is given everything that's happening in the news. You can also follow this particular show, Pastor's Point of View, in podcast format. Just go to wherever it is you get your podcasts and put in Pastor's Point of View, or Andy Wood's Pastor's Point of View, or Dr. Wood's PPOV, and you should be able to find it. It's available on Spotify, Podcast Addict, Pocket Casts, Listen Notes, Podcast Index, Amazon Music, Podchaser, Deezer, Player FM, RSS Feed, and of course Apple. You can find it there as well. We're very happy to note that our podcast, starting from nothing, starting from scratch just a few months ago, is doing, the experts tell us, exceptionally and extraordinarily well in terms of downloads. So thank you for making that happen. And tell your friends about the podcast as well if you're interested in this information in podcast format. You can also click on Andy Wood's Ministries on something called Amazon Smile, and whatever purchases you make on Amazon, part of the proceeds will go to Andy Wood's Ministries. If you're interested in donating to Chaffer Theological Seminary, Chaffer is also available on Amazon Smile as well. Just had a lot of people recently tell me that they've been doing that, and so we appreciate it very much, and they wanted to make sure that I communicated this Amazon Smile option. Coming up this coming week is going to be the Chaffer Theological Seminary Conference. It's going to go Monday afternoon, all day Tuesday, all day Wednesday, March 7th through 9th. And our keynote speaker is going to be dealing with the issue of creationism and its importance in terms of the outworking of God's program. And there's going to be other speakers as well dealing with other subjects. I think I'm speaking on Wednesday. I want to say Wednesday afternoon, if I remember correctly, and I'm going to be dealing with the whole issue of controversial subject, cessationism. Is there an actual biblical belief for saying some spiritual gifts have passed away and other spiritual gifts continue on, based on 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verses 8 through 10, which says, when the perfect comes, some of the spiritual gifts will pass away. What exactly is the perfect? And so I'm going to be dealing with that controversial issue at the Chaffer Theological Seminary conference. And it's going to be held at nearby West Houston Bible Church. If you can't make it into the building in person, West Houston Bible Church does a fantastic job of live streaming and archiving. So go to Dean Bible Ministries, a website called Dean Bible Ministries, to learn about the conference schedule, and also the live streaming and archive options. I would encourage you also to find Andy Wood's Ministries on Rumble. Just have your settings set to channels, type in Andy Wood's Ministries, and the recent presentations that we've done should be there on Rumble. And this presentation that we're doing here is going to be quickly uploaded onto Rumble and YouTube after we get off the air. Check us out on YouTube. Just type in Andy Woods into your YouTube search engine, and you'll see a lot of our programs and Bible studies. I think we have somewhere around 800 videos on our YouTube channel. And if you're interested in actually seeing these show notes that I've been reading from, with all of these different articles, just go to Andy Wood's Ministries, our website, and andywoodsministries.org, I believe it is. And on the homepage, what you'll see is an ability to sign up for our newsletter. And so every time we upload a pastor's point of view, the show notes that go with these pastor's points of view programs will show up in your inbox, and we encourage you to take advantage of that. We're also happy to note that Pastor's Point of View is now available on Frank's Speech. We're very grateful to Mike Lindell and Brandon House and all of those wonderful patriots there that have put that network together, that we have a chance to upload Pastor's Points of View shows onto that network. So just go to TV shows and then scroll down and look for Pastor's Point of View, and you should be able to find there some of our most recent Pastor's Point of View shows. Well, thank you for your patience. Thanks for listening. That's all I have for you today in this particular prophecy update, and we will be back with you very soon. Some of you have been asking about Pastor Jim. How come he hasn't been with you recently? It just has to do with scheduling issues. Our church is growing by the grace of God. Our ministry is growing, and that sort of creates an extra pull on staff members in different directions. But we're hoping to have Pastor Jim back as a regular on Pastor's Point of View. I know everybody out there enjoys having him on, but sort of in the interim, you're stuck with me, and I apologize for having to come on here and do a monologue. It's much more enjoyable to listen to a dialogue, but at the same time, we feel that this information that we're bringing you is so pertinent that we've got to get it out to you, regardless of what format we choose to use. So with all that being said, I will see you next time. Thanks for listening, and God bless you.